Hello there, you're watching The Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with The Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and The Telegraph's chief political correspondent, Christopher Hope. So a very good evening to both of you. And Christopher and Sonia will be with us through until midnight. First, though, let's go through what's on tomorrow's front pages. And The Telegraph leads with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pleading with the West to help avert what he says could become a genocide of his people. The Guardian leads with the scramble by Ukrainian refugees to escape the capital. Its headline, "Desperate Rush for the Last Train from Kiev." Pray for Kiev, says the Daily Mail, which pictures the TV tower there, which was destroyed in a missile attack, killing 5 people. The Sun has just one word for the Russian attack on a Holocaust memorial site in Kiev: barbaric. Reporting on a walkout by more than 100 UN diplomats at the UN Human Rights Council during a speech by the Russian foreign minister, the Metro has the headline, "Shunned by the World." The Eye leads with what it calls the siege of Kiev and quotes Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, who says President Putin is now pursuing a siege, starve and surrender strategy. And the Financial Times has word of China offering itself as a peacemaker in the conflict. And just a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers for yourself while you watch us. But let's bring in then Sonia Sodha and Christopher Hope to go through some of these front pages. And I noticed, Sonia, that all the front pages once again dominated by Ukraine, but each one takes a different angle because there are so many different facets to this story, aren't there? You've picked out the Telegraph's front page, first of all, and it pictures President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and the headline says that he's pleading with the West to prevent genocide. So what kind of intervention is he calling for here?
Well, he did a tweet today where he said, you know, what was the point of sort of the Second World War if these things are all going to be allowed to happen again? And he was speaking specifically about the bombing attack on a TV tower in Kiev, which killed 5 people and damaged a Holocaust memorial, a very, very significant Holocaust memorial for Ukraine, where, which marked the deaths of thousands of Ukrainian Jews in the Second World War. And I think this really, the plea from President Zelensky really speaks to the terrible position now that I think Ukraine is in and the West is in, which is that when you get to this stage of conflict, when you've got an aggressor like Russia determined to do so much damage with paying no heed to the loss of civilian life, there are only terrible options and even more terrible options in a war, I think. And I completely understand the appeal for the West to do more. The problem is when you take a stand back and look at the conflict and look at where Russia is and what might happen if the West were to intervene militarily directly, which is what either a no-fly zone would be. There've even been some pleas for the West to sort of intervene and bomb the convoys going into Kiev, which we think will lead to a siege of the city. If the West get involved, if NATO gets involved, that's an escalation, even further escalation. And there's no telling what Putin will do next. So I think the West has to do absolutely everything that it can to minimize the humanitarian crisis that is now already on our hands. And I think there are some things that the West really did get wrong on Syria when it came to humanitarian aid, when it came to getting people out ahead of siege, which it really needs to learn the lesson on this time. But I think that at the moment, escalating the conflict by NATO countries getting involved directly could lead to an even worse outcome for the people of Ukraine, but elsewhere too.
Christopher, do you agree with that? Because this article does, it quotes the chief rabbi of Ukraine talking about that 40-mile-long convoy that's outside the capital, saying, bomb it, stop it. We've also had these calls, as Sonia was saying, for a no-fly zone. But again, as she was saying, there is this very difficult decision. Do you move in further to protect people, or does that draw more people potentially into a conflict?
Yeah. Well, at the heart of this is, Anna, it's self-interest. So you have the NATO countries. Yes, of course, they're bound by Article 5. So if one country is attacked, they're all attacked. Ukraine is not a NATO country, and that's what's holding them back. They can't really afford, and they haven't put into their risk analysis yet, the prospect of taking on Russia jets, Russia fighters, and certainly by enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that might lead to shooting down Russian planes, Russian jets. And that's the problem. And that's why the West has to sit there and watch this 40-mile long parade of tanks descending on Kiev with little to do apart from warm words. And that's the frustration, I think, of the Ukrainians. The ones I speak to, certainly for my podcast, they are really concerned about the fact that all we're doing is saying, well, we can't help here, we have to wait and see, and that's not on. And that's a concern.
Well, yes, and Sonia, obviously the West would say we have introduced some really punishing sanctions. And if you look at the front page of the Metro, they are saying that Russia is isolated. The picture on the front page is pictures, delegates walking out at the UN Human Rights session in Geneva when Sergei Lavrov was speaking, Russia's foreign minister. I mean, they are increasingly isolated, Russia. I mean, how much difference could that make?
Well, I think that President Putin will be surprised, actually, by the strength of the response from the West, and that comes through economic sanctions. I think it took longer to impose tough sanctions than would have ideally been the case, but they are in place now. There's also very big actions being taken in terms of soft power, in terms of cultural power. So, for example, in terms of sporting contests. But I think, I think there will be a time when we look back and think, how did the West let it get to this point? And that for me is kind of, maybe it's not a question for right now, because we have to do as much as we can and take the best course of action in the moment we find ourselves. But I do think that historians will look back on this, and there's a very big question about how the West, how NATO, how the US, the UK and Europe were so complacent about Putin and about Russia, because I think very reasonably the question that Ukrainians might ask us is, how did we let it get to this stage? We were warning you all for years that this could happen.
And moving on to the Financial Times, actually in the Metro it does say that of those envoys who didn't walk out, apparently countries like China, Syria and Venezuela, that's interesting to bear in mind when you look at the front page of the Financial Times, yes, isn't it, Christopher? Because they're saying China is offering themselves up as a role, in the role as peacemaker. How surprising is that, and what exactly are they offering?
Well, to which many might say about time, because China sat there. I don't think it condemned Russia at the weekend with a vote in the Security Council. So if this is the case, they are signalling that China is offering a role as peacemaker. That's a really good start, and the quotes in Beijing are saying they're extremely concerned about the harm to civilians, and that comment came after a phone call from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to his Ukrainian counterpart. I think that shows a degree of concern because, of course, don't forget, China is affected by all of these various sanctions being brought into place. The removal of rights to airspace over parts of Russia, by Russia towards Europe and vice versa over the EU and Britain means that it will affect trade. I think that may be what's driving China. But of course, China will be concerned by the loss of life, particularly with what may be happening in Kiev in the coming days. So I think the fact that China's put its hand up is a good sign.
Well, I mean, Sonia, how much hope do you think there is for diplomacy now?
Well, I think you've always got to keep trying it. But I think, with where President Putin's coming from, I think the worrying thing about the situation is that, he doesn't appear to be acting rationally. He's massively misjudged. There's stuff that's leaked, media reports that were sort of pre-written that suggest that the Russians were expecting this to be a very quick, easy victory, that they would have basically occupied Ukraine by now. It would have surrendered, and they'd be running things, and that the end goal was a sort of united Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So he's, President Putin. It's very hard to know exactly how he's going to react, But, you've got to sort of try and keep talking. As expected, though, what's been issued from Russia and Putin so far is basically nothing short of Ukraine's complete surrender, which, as a democratic, free country, is completely intolerable. The one thing I will say about China is, of course, acting in its own self-interest as well. And, I think people will sort of have a bit of a wry sort of take at its comment that it's worried about the welfare of civilians, given what China is doing to the Uyghur people itself. There are acts of genocide going on in China. So it's, maybe China can play a role, but obviously China will be acting in its own self-interest too.
And let's move on to The Guardian, Christopher, because they have a different take, a very kind of human angle to their front page story. Desperate rush for the last train from Kiev. And a touching picture, really, of a woman on a train, obviously a scramble to get on that train, and a reminder of all the many stories, not just of people being in the direct line of fire, but people making desperate decisions about their families.
That's right, and this is where I think newspapers often come into their own with this amazing reporting. This one by Sean Walker in Kiev for The Guardian. He starts, the piercing screams of children mingled with the barking of traumatized dogs and the shouts of soldiers trying to maintain order. We have seen the footage on TV of this, but I do think this is a classic case of really good foreign reporting here by The Guardian, putting it on page one. Other papers have done it differently. The Telegraph have done, and we have done, and we'll see that later. But it just shows the horrors and the choices you've got to make so quickly. You're not sure what's going to happen next. Do you hang around? Do you stay with your husband or your partner? Or do you, if you're a woman, leave the city? It seems that women and children were encouraged to go and not men by the police. Is that right? Is that the right call to make? Or do you hang around and support your friends and family? I mean, and these choices are made in real time, very quickly. And I think a lot of people can look at that and go, gosh, it could be any of us.
Yeah, so it's hard to put ourselves in that position, isn't it? Really tough decisions being made. Let's move inside the Metro next, Sonia, because there was an extraordinary moment when Boris Johnson was holding a news conference in Warsaw today, when a Ukrainian journalist stood up and talked about the plight of the people that she'd left behind herself in Kiev, and talked about the need for a no-fly zone. And although we've talked about how that issue of a no-fly zone has cropped up in copy elsewhere, it's when you have a story like this and a woman who speaks so passionately that the story really cuts through and makes more headlines, doesn't it?
I think it was such a powerful moment. It was so good to see somebody stand up and confront the Prime Minister with the reality of what's going on in the ground in Ukraine, talking about the experiences of her family and friends. I'm sure Johnson's aware of it, but there's nothing like hearing it from somebody who's directly affected. And I just think it speaks to this terrible, terrible dilemma that the West now finds it in, which really I think it could have avoided by taking different actions to get up to this point. Obviously, the benefit of hindsight is a fine thing. But, the West is in a terrible position now where if doing nothing is not a neutral choice, there will be mass civilian casualties. We're already seeing them, but on a scale that we can't even imagine. Cities under siege in Ukraine, which will cause terrible suffering, but at the same time,
thing is,
Go on, Christopher, very quickly. We've only got a few seconds.
What was so important? She said, what's the alternative, Prime Minister, to not enforcing a no-fly zone? And that's the problem. Do you do a safe zone in the western half of Ukraine? What do you do? And what is the result? There's no obvious answer, and that is the tragedy.
OK, well, Christopher Hope, Sonia Sodha, I'm very pleased to say that you will stay on. There are still loads more issues that we can discuss at 11. But for the moment, thanks very much indeed.